Charlotte Knight, architecturally educated, works for Field and Clegg Bradley Studios. Here she is.
Testing.
I have this quite flamboyant wrist action when I'm holding a phallic object. In this case, a microphone.
From the lab to your ears.
You're listening to WonderLabs.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, checking in from London town. Sometimes it's nice to catch an idea before it's fully formed, when parts of it are being spoken out loud for the first time, when the parts that have promise are still covered in dirt. I'm fortunate to have creative people in my life who are always playing with ideas, even if they seem wildly unrealistic. God knows, we need to be able to play with ideas right now. With the dearth of activities and social engagements, creativity is about all we have left. To put it bluntly, the city feels like it's dying. Time will tell whether anything interesting will be born from its ashes, or whether it'll be abandoned for greener pastures. Rather than hoping for one or the other, I've resigned myself to accepting the collective direction humanity decides to take. But that comes with a certain amount of mourning. The city's a place that's given myself and many others so much. It was a place to embrace culture, eat delicious food, and embrace chance encounters with strangers who might become friends. I once met a fellow music fan in a queue outside of a record store in Soho. We turned up embarrassingly early to catch one of our favourite DJs play an intimate set, and were among the only people in line. Fast forward a few months, and I was invited to join her and her partner at a festival in Croatia. Fast forward again, and that same couple joined my wife and I on part of our honeymoon, hiking for days through the Brazilian jungle, foolishly without a guide. Those are the kinds of chance encounters that the city facilitates, if you let it. Those are the chance encounters that I'm mourning, along with the ostensible death of every gallery, club, and community space. Happily, some of those chance encounters have managed to outlive the city's premature passing, and I'm pleased to finally welcome the couple I just mentioned onto the show. Charlotte Knight and Lloyd Preston-Allen currently spend their working days in architecture and property development, but they have a strong joint interest in building community through design. And I've brought them onto the show to talk about a project tentatively called Colive19. It's a co-living space that seeks to address some of the issues that have plagued cities for years, like rocketing rents, and some of the newer issues like the decimation of cultural capital. Colive19 is an idea not yet fully formed. Parts of it are being spoken aloud for the very first time, and the parts that have promise are still covered in dirt. In this episode, we talk about how space first captured Charlotte and Lloyd's imaginations, the constraints imposed by formal education and commercialization, and the relative value of aesthetic and function. We also talk about good and bad cities, integrating culture with nature, and the future of urban living in a post-pandemic world, including their plans with Colive19. It's a fascinating tumble into the rabbit hole with two great minds I truly adore. I invite you to get creative as you listen to another idea in motion. Perhaps you'll consider what, if anything, the city still has to offer you. Perhaps you'll consider joining the rural revival. So before we get to any questions, I have to say I quite like sitting outside in this space.
It's a really great space to be in, isn't it?
In East London.
Hackney.
During a global pandemic. It's pretty far out.
I think there are worse places to be in a global pandemic.
Correct.
But this is the space of two people who clearly know what space is about. Am I right?
I would agree, yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning. What was it that first got you thinking about space?
I think for me, when I think of space, I think of, number one, fantasy, if you're on one side of the fence. But on the other side, I see parameters. Some people see parameters, some people see fantasy. For me, space has always been about fantasy. It's always been about a situation, an experience, and in essence, a place. And I think that set me off on a certain trajectory, thinking about the life I wanted to create for myself and others. So I think that's what got me interested in space. It was definitely not the confines of space. And when you ask people about space, they think of four walls, they think of a roof, they think of a home, which is an emotional connection they have with a specific space, but they often think of confines. For me, it's completely opposite.
So I think continuing on from what Lloyd was just saying, he's hit the nail on the head there, is I think space is the wrong word. What I was becoming really interested in was, creating this beautiful fantasy that was about creating different environments. Your imagination starts to run wild as a child, whether you're out in the fields playing with your friends, you start building rope swings hanging from the river, you start swinging out over, you start creating dens for yourself. Lloyd and I have been together a really long time, but one of the things that brought us together was we loved creating dens with one another. Even at 18, we were still little children at heart. So I think it's the fact that imagination was running free wild, and we're very creative people.
Yeah, and in essence, that is what childhood is. It's that untrammeled, constantly receiving new information and playing with it, and playing with ideas, and playing with spaces. When you then segue from early experiences into professional training, right? How does that train you to think, and how does it impose certain ideologies, beliefs, restrictions, ways of seeing, ways of thinking, and ways of creating space that maybe shift that sort of fundamental thinking that you started off with?
Well, I think the first thing is that as soon as you go into your training, you start to become a lot more rational about design and space. There are always problems that are created, and you need to come up with the solutions. That's the best thing about architecture, is you'll always be met with problems, but you're taught from a very early age that there are always solutions no matter what situation you're in. And that's a really great way of developing thinking. The other side of that is that you are constantly developing, so therefore you're constantly criticizing your own work, evaluating, redesigning, and that is a repetitive thing that is a continuous. No piece of work is ever finished. You've never reached your masterpiece.
It's art in that sense.
It's art.
So we both come from an architectural background. We've both followed different paths. I think we share the same ethos in life. But I think it's fair to say that I struggled, or architectural education as I saw it didn't resonate as much as it did with Charlotte. I struggled because I went to a practical university. It was about material. It was about space. It was about volume. It was about the four walls. It was about buildings being technically accomplished. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think both of us want to achieve the creation of spaces and places and buildings that are technically accomplished. But it was the humanity that I was interested in, the fact that places could be technically accomplished but also humane. What architectural education didn't give me is an understanding of the immaterial. It gave me an understanding of the material, and it wasn't enough. My studio tutors were practicing architects, really accomplished individuals and practitioners, but their key kind of their focus on the day-to-day was the material, was orientation, sunlight, daylight, the quality of the space that you were creating. It was not necessarily creating a content machine. It was not about how you inhabit those places and spaces and how people interact and the collisions that are created through that volumetric study.
So in a similar vein to the materials lending themselves to an experience in a space. Similarly, when you move beyond education into the realm of working and practice, it seems to me at least there must be a tension between aesthetic and function. So in some ways those things exist in opposition to one another, where if you are focused more on creating that experience, then that doesn't necessarily lead to a project that is, say, financially viable or the kind of thing that would get past other people with conflicting interests. How do you manage to maintain aesthetic in a world that I would imagine is quite focused and fixated on function? And can you make the case that the aesthetic is a function?
Yes, I think it's the other way around. I think people are actually focused a little bit too much on the aesthetic and less about the function or the care towards others who are the end users who will be moving into that space or that piece of architecture. So when it comes down to form and function, they're like yin and yang. They go together, and then there needs to be a balance that's found. And so, yes, it is very difficult. An architect has to look at everything in life that's going on. You have to be a psychologist, you have to be environmentalist, engineer, everything all at the same time. You are leading a design team where you have to look at physical requirements, user experience, time, money, context settings, religion, technology, culture, scale, complexity, interactions with human in the built environment. And so all of these things are a bit of a struggle, but that is what the architect is there to do.
So I guess we all have a sense of what it's like to exist within spaces in a city that don't necessarily prioritize well-being experience. And I know that you've spent some time in different spaces, in different cities, in different countries. And when you have been traveling, where stands out to you as being places that do a good job of being mindful and conscious and building experience into the space?
Well, if I think about that, for me, it's somewhere that I could call a second home. So for me, it was always the hostels that when I was traveling around the world, where I had that feeling of community, where I was welcomed into somebody else's space, where they made me feel at home. And one of my favorite places that I visited was a place in Bocas de Toro in Panama. And it was called Bambuda Lodge. And it was somewhere that you instantly felt completely relaxed and you were in a safe place. Where do you think that you have been where you've had a really great experience of space that has made you feel whole and at peace?
So I'd say there are two places I've lived that have been opposite extremes. I spent some time living in Jakarta, which is not designed with pedestrians in mind at all. If you were to construct a hierarchy of importance, it's cars, motorcyclists, pedestrians. Everything's very busy, everything's very chaotic. The houses are quite cramped together because there's a lot of people living there. There is no respect for the orientation of the building with respect to sunlight. On the flip side, I've spent time living in rural Japan with views of the ocean and views of sunrise and sunset and everything that is very calculated and very well constructed with the elements and with nature in mind. And this particular village was built into the forest with parts on stilts so as not to interfere with the surrounding ecosystems, and you were greeted with the sound of birds every morning. It was clearly something that had been thought about, and humans were integrating into the environment as opposed to destroying it to just prop up some buildings.
You're talking a lot about nature, which I think is important. And for us, where we felt the most connected were perhaps some of the situations or spaces, in inverted commas, that humans hadn't created. Perhaps they were rainforests, perhaps they were natural auditoriums. Perhaps they were organic spaces that had been carved out of the earth through chance, I guess. But I think if we're talking about space in terms of a human intervention, I think a successful architectural intervention brings us closer to larger, more complex systems. It's not about the separation from those systems. It's about allowing us to understand them better. So the question for me is really, how are we embedded into a myriad of systems, not what systems are we embedded into?
Chris, coming back to your earlier point about your experiences in different places,
right,
but in the cases you've chosen cities, I would tend to agree that there are cities that have obviously thought about the design and the operation of those places, and those that haven't. For example, I think Sao Paulo, for me, is a really good example of where you've had a whole city that's been designed around the car.
Mm-hmm.
Even to cross the road, you're sometimes crossing 10, carriageways, as it were. A good example for me of where a city starts to operate well is not necessarily around the design per se and the layout of the city, but more around the systems that they put in place in order to operate successfully. For example, Curitiba, 2/3 of their waste is recycled by everybody who lives within the city. So it's everybody's responsibility to pick up the rubbish and recycle it. But I think for me, after traveling to so many different cities around the world, been to Shanghai or even Wellington in New Zealand, I think London for me is still the best city in the world.
Why?
One of the reasons that makes London so successful is based on its medieval layout, right? London has been built around the Thames. We started off with the city. Next came everything that sat outside those city walls that became a more structured, gridded environment. So you start off with the dense medieval plan within the centre. So for me, first and foremost, I start to think about the layout of the city. But then after that, it starts to become about the organisation and the growth that happens outside that. If you take Barcelona as a city, in contrast, everything was designed and based around a very gridded city. London, in contrast to Barcelona, offers that theatricalization of a city. Your imagination is allowed to wander down through narrow medieval streets, and then you break out into wide open spaces of parks that are dotted throughout the city. You have a constant access to green space in London. They're actually trying to become part of a city club that is known as being a garden city. London has the most amount of green spaces as any city in the UK.
This is something that I've been thinking about and speaking about lately, specifically with Barcelona and London in mind. So where Barcelona may exist in this grid-like system that has that sort of signature modular construction that you can see from an aerial view, each one of those modules offers its residents a certain set of things. It's maybe got a plaza and some certain amount of green space and places where people can congregate and markets where local people go to, as opposed to having to travel really far away. So in that sense, could you not make the case that cities like that are built more with community in mind than the more sporadic, sprawling endlessness of something like London?
Yes, you could, but I think that who wants to live in a gridded city? Who wants to live where everything is the same, where every corner is the same? You don't know where you are. You're on 52nd Street or 57th Street. Here when I'm walking and wandering down through the city, I'm on Ironmonger's Lane. The history that's behind those streets is just beautiful. I really get lost within those streets. Another example of a space that Lloyd and I have both experienced, or a city, is St. Petersburg. For me, it was terrifying. Big, huge, long, open roads, endless, never anything in sight, endless, with 4-story, big Soviet concrete buildings next to you. So that is another example of an extremely gridded city, which I find quite terrifying to live within. I find Barcelona similar, although it has outbreaks of beautiful space. But for me, the most successful cities are the unplanned ones, where things are allowed to grow and develop over time, with not necessarily a huge amount of pre-planning.
I think what we're talking about here is sociability, aren't we? We're talking about connection and the spaces which allow that connection to happen and allow those collisions to happen. So when we're talking about a certain rigidity or pragmatism applied to, I guess, urban planning, when you're talking about Barcelona with its squares and with its segregated areas of the city which respond to a certain requirement. That requirement is responding to a certain personnel. They have certain requirements. Therefore, you're creating segregation. So that rigidity and that process of delivering something for a select array of individuals, I think, is valuable for sure. I mean, Jane Jacobs, I think, would disagree with you entirely when you talk about the rigidity of a city like New York or perhaps Paris, or you mentioned Barcelona. I think what those cities do often is or what the notion or the ideology does is they oversimplify the complexity of human lives in quite diverse communities. So Jane Jacobs, she wrote a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and her argument, a scathing review of urban planning, is the fact that it's too regimented.
Okay.
It's too meticulous, and actually those confines and those parameters that we set ourselves actually deliver an environment and a space which is poor and is too meticulous and too overworked, effectively. What she's interested in is in the interrelationships and the interdependencies of communities and individuals. And often, well, in her book, she talks about how these types of connections emerge organically. And I think when we're talking about London in particular, it has emerged organically.
Okay, let's imagine for a second then that you're in charge of either a city that is currently small or somewhere in the developing world that doesn't yet have anything baked in. Would you impose that rigidity that you alluded to, or would you allow something to flourish more organically in the way that, say, London has over time?
Would I create order, or would I allow it to emerge naturally out of the ether?
Because let's say the people there value certain things that aren't conducive for the sort of space that would be healthy. How can you trust in that organic process without imposing some form of rigidity?
What is essential to allow society to exist and to give us a certain quality of life? It's infrastructure. When you talk about infrastructure, you often talk about hard infrastructure. You talk about electricity, you talk about running water, you talk about sanitation. I also think social infrastructure is really quite important. Social infrastructure is things like libraries, things like sidewalks, things and objects or areas or spaces that allow people to interact and allow life to proceed. So I think there is, in essence, a certain order that you need to create and offer the essentials that allow us to operate in a certain manner and to give us a certain quality of life. Again, I'm going to talk about Jane Jacobs. She talks about sidewalks. It's not called a sidewalk in the UK, it's called a pavement. But she talks about sidewalks as the central mechanism in maintaining the order in a city. I think that's really interesting. And she talks about things like the sidewalk being or operating as a ballet, and space being temporal, and people interacting or using that space for a certain period of time. And in her book, she talks about observing these types of spaces. And those places are essential. The space doesn't create that interaction. What creates that interaction is people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not a decentrist. I mean, Charlotte and I are living in an urban environment right now. Cities are killing us. I think that's a problem. It's a problem that we can sort out. Absolutely. It's going to take time. But fundamentally, we're in a predicament whereby we're thinking about moving outside of the city. Better air, less pollution, more space, better volume, better light, connection with nature. All of these things we've been talking about. But can urban environments create these types of situations? Of course they can. There's precedents, and we've seen it throughout the world. It's like anything. It's like a garden. You know, a garden never stops moving. It's dynamic. It's not static.
You mentioned social infrastructure, and you spoke about temporality and the fact that a space is not the same space at different moments in time, and how it's used at different moments in time can be quite different. Thinking about that and the fact that the social infrastructure that a city like London usually has, with the fact that we're now in a pandemic, is there a space, if you will, for the city in future? Because it seems like throughout this conversation, we've touched quite a lot on what makes living healthy, what allows people to flourish in a space is being in touch with nature. And if we're not getting the nourishment that we need, if that social infrastructure is no longer available, if people are leaving the city en masse, what is the future of the city?
I think the future of the city is a really interesting question post-COVID crisis. I think the first thing that we need to do to approach that question is imagine what the outcomes are at the moment of a city that's going through a pandemic. There's, for example, less movement, a stronger sense of community, there's less transport, people are being encouraged to walk and cycle more, and therefore reducing the amount of interaction that they're having. So I think to not have those physical spaces available anymore to society, to the globe, is quite terrifying. The crisis has exposed deeply the divide between societies, the unbalance that's there, the unsustainability. And I think fundamentally in London in particular, what it's come down to again is class and rent. I think those are the two big factors that we'll now be looking at. Lloyd and I think, fit into that perfectly in terms of, this is something we're strongly considering now. How can we continue to afford living in London? And of course, with all of those social engagements removed from us, we are not able to enjoy the city as we once did in terms of the cultural connections that we were getting.
Sure.
What are we going to do? Now we're going to run away to nature and of course, having those things removed from our lives has completely opened our eyes to the fact that, okay, what is good for our health and well-being? What do we want to get from our lives? And Lloyd and I have been talking about this endlessly over the last 6 months in lockdown together.
And I really want to find out how far that thought process has come. But really what you just described to me seems like a loop where you lose the social infrastructure. So the people that were interested in the social infrastructure tend to leave. And those, or at least some of those people, are perhaps the people that would be creating the social infrastructure in the first place. So what you have is this feedback loop that is now in motion where more and more people are thinking about exiting the city. But the destruction of one thing is always an opportunity for creation in something else. So with people such as yourselves thinking about leaving the city, it's the end of something but the beginning of something new. What is the something new?
I think what we need to understand collectively is we're all singing from a global hymn sheet.
Lloyd, what you've massively just missed is the leading question that our dear friend Mr. Chris Richardson was setting us up for. What is the big idea? It's Coliv-19, my friend. So Lloyd and I have been incredibly lucky to be able to spend our lockdown in a bubble with our dear friends. And during this time, it was a beautiful opportunity to critically reflect upon our lives, have a look at the situation that we're currently in, and question, what do we really want to get out of life? Where do I want to be? What's the kind of thing that I want to be getting from the city that I'm living in? Is it going to provide everything that I most cherish, want, or love, or need in life? Is it going to provide me with the health and well-being that myself and my friends require? Is it going to provide the space that we require? And I think lockdown was a really good test of that. So the big idea is Coliv-19.
Trademarked.
A huge issue in London, more than anywhere else in the world, is property speculation, and it's just made the crisis worse. One of the things that Coliv-19 aims to do is to bring young people together who are struggling in the city to be able to afford the space that they would like to be able to live in. And co-live is exactly how it sounds. It's a co-housing scheme where you would unite with a group of friends in order to be able to buy property and make it your own and into the community and social infrastructure that you require.
Coliv-19, increasing dialogue, connecting spheres. Trademark.
To me, that almost reflects your own journey. You've started out dreaming about what is possible, what experiences can you create by putting a body in a certain situation. You come to the city, it's loud, it's very in your face, it's very hostile, it's very difficult to live here, but it's also the place where you meet amazing people and have access to that social infrastructure, have access to that training where you can allow ideas to develop and flourish and come to fruition, and then you're able to return full circle and exit. How do you see your role unfolding? Does it remain within the city and attempting to rebuild and redefine and maybe even reclaim and pedestrianize some of the areas that were once dominated by cars and to really make the most of those opportunities? Or is it removing yourself from the city entirely in search of something new, or indeed returning to your roots?
How I see my role changing as an architect in the future now is I'm stuck in two minds. Half of me is stuck in the city and wanting to create better futures for people here through social connections. I'm an architect that's very much focused upon social agenda, environmental agenda. First and foremost, I see myself being able to establish that on a much smaller scale by taking myself outside of the city and creating that ideal system in a rural situation. And it's only operating at such a small scale, I can see how that design would operate and function in a small community. And learning from that, I would then be able to apply it to a much larger situation within the city.
There is a huge amount of uncertainty, but I think for me, I'll go back to what we started with, and it's fantasy, aspiration, desire. For me, the fantasy is to create a place and a space where people experience something out of their situational medium. I mean, even in lockdown, people have taken up art. For instance, what does art do? It allows you to create a medium and allows you to create life outside of your situational medium. You're creating your own medium, effectively. It's fantasy. So for me, creating a space where people are able to attempt to fulfill those aspirations is really, really important.
We are creatives at the end of the day, and our imaginations will always run wild. So although we might be in what people might think of as quite a dark time at the moment, there will be beautiful outcomes that come out of this.
And I will be the first to come and skip merrily down to co-live and
Mate, you
Put
are.
on some face
You're going to
paint.
be right there by us on the left.
Take off some clothes.
Right.
Have a swim. Wow. That was a trip.
It was indeed.
That wasn't a trip, my friend. That was a journey.
That was so good.
I enjoyed that. But before I let you go, back to this beautiful space, I'd like to wrap up with a quick fire round.
Oh, okay.
All right.
What does that involve?
A few quick questions, a few quick answers.
Okay, together?
Yeah, but you can...
We
you
are
can-
one.
Sure.
We talk.
All right.
We talk as one.
Which emerging field are you most excited about?
Listening to trees, mainly.
Tree consciousness.
The field that I'm most interested in at the moment is biophilic design.
What is that?
So biophilic design is about introducing the natural world within architecture and therefore improving people's health and well-being.
Is there a tool that you use in your work that you're particularly fond of?
I prefer the carrot and not the stick.
The tool that I most enjoy using when I'm looking at design is obviously the sketchbook and the pen.
Classic. Nice.
It's classic. It's classic because there doesn't have to be any rational thought behind your initial touch to the page with the pen. There is a freedom that is allowed through sketching and imagination and creativity.
If you could wave a magic wand and shift everyone's collective thinking on one thing related to architecture, what would it be?
The most important thing is that I would ask those in charge to think about those that they are creating spaces for the end users, and to consider social agendas above economical gains.
I think for me it's about emotion. I think people need to understand the emotion of space. And when you're designing for someone, you need to design for someone, whether that's a collective or an individual, and you need to understand their emotions. Understanding those emotions takes time. It takes engagement, it takes empathy, it takes understanding. So yeah, I think often as space creators, we need to understand people. We also need to understand the cosmos and allow people to understand the cosmos. And I think that is undoubtedly allowing them to connect with something greater.
What's your best architecture-related fact or joke?
Form follows function. Golden rule number 1. By this, we mean that the function of a space is far more important than what it looks like.
Not sure this is a fact, but I think it's probably a statement.
No, that wasn't the question, Lloyd.
I just say space is a fantasy and not a parameter.
What is one thing that everyone should do after listening to this?
Take acid.
Charlotte and Lloyd, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Chris Richardson, as always, absolute pleasure. Many thanks.
Chris, otherwise known as the Great White, we love you very much.
I'll see you at CoLive 19.
See you there.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston-Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.
From the lab to your ears.
You're listening to WonderLabs with Uncle Chris.